our next session, Combating Fraud with Intelligent and Agile Tools. I know this is something that, particularly on the merchant side, you're constantly fighting, always behind the fraudsters. And more technology now is enabling us to automate, to use generative AI, but still, the fraudsters are using those tools as well. So our next panel is moderated by Jeremy King. Jeremy is Regional VP, EMEA for the PCI Security Standards Council and has been for the last 14 years. So here's somebody that knows what they're talking about when it comes to the PCI Council, and maybe you can help the bankers as well with their standards.
Oh, absolutely, yeah, definitely.
And the lovely panel, so please come to the stage.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for staying. I would say, just as the panel sits down, that I'm glad to see that the lessons we learn at school never leave us, that everyone always sits at the back in the dark where no one can see you. So, thank you. I would say, do use the app. If you want to ask a question, I've got my phone open. I'm going to do the balancing act of how many things can I balance on my legs at the same time and try and get this thing going. So if you've got any question at any time, do send them in, and we will try and answer them. So, good afternoon, gentlemen. Quick 30-second introduction.
I'm Cameron Russell. I'm eBay's global privacy lead for financial services and digital assets.
I'm Gary French. I'm a senior director at Etsy in charge of global regulatory operations, and I'm also the CEO of Etsy Payments Ireland.
Yeah, hello everyone. I'm Richard Hellier, Vice President EMEA for SIFT. Been in the fraud industry now for the best part of 9 years.
We were going to be a bigger panel. You can see there are 2 empty seats. Unfortunately, Mo has been taken ill. Nothing serious, but unfortunately was unable to make it. And Murray McKenzie has been summoned for jury service. So obviously they saw him as a true security professional and wanted him to get their view on the jury. So without further ado, because the clock is ticking, let's set off on our journey of talking about fraud. And I'm going to start with the issue of how much fraud is happening. The UK Finance each year publishes a fraud report. And the 2023 report, I'm avidly waiting, 24 coming out soon, indicated for a 4th annual year a reduction in card-related e-com fraud, but at the same time a huge increase in open banking push payment fraud. I'll go along the panel. How does that fit with your own experiences of e-com fraud? Do you want to start off, Cameron, and then we'll just run it through?
Yeah, I think those numbers sound about right to me. It's always an evolving landscape. From my seat, I guess, as the lawyer and privacy subject matter expert, it creates additional challenges because what we need to collect and what we need to do might be evolving at certain times, and the law might lag behind that. There's certainly, I see challenges between what financial regulators expect and what data protection authorities expect, and those don't always neatly align within the specific legal frameworks. I'll talk a little bit about that in a bit, I think. But also, in reality, we have to react in real time, and we have to evolve in real time, and we have to try to stay ahead of the bad guys in real time, and that creates a challenge to know exactly how those data elements that we need to collect and process align within the legal frameworks if we need to move fast.
Thank you very much. And Gary, what about yourself?
So for me, I was actually surprised to see that it was reducing over time. I think, though, if you think of it in terms of pure losses, yes, I suppose that makes sense that the numbers are going down, but doesn't mean fraudsters have gone away. It doesn't mean that the number of attempts that we're seeing on our platforms haven't either stayed steady or increased over time as those fraudsters become more prevalent and persistent. I think what it does show is that we've gotten better at dealing with it, at detecting it, at preventing it, and I suppose it's now become, or has been for some time now, a necessary part of doing business as an e-commerce.
And that's an interesting perspective because, as you say, figures can hide anything.
Yep.
Is it, it's interesting that you were saying there that actually we've got better at detecting it. Is that something you've, within your organization that you're driving and trying to help sort of pick out the fraudulent transactions early?
Yeah, for sure, and it's something we're very focused on. I think really it's, putting a lot of emphasis on building the capabilities internally or partnering with legitimate partners to help us build better solutions. And what we're trying to do is really identify and stop that fraud up funnel and really take our users out of the experience of being involved in a fraud in some way. And that is our priority.
Yeah. And I think that is one of those things that sort of quietly goes on the background, and we never sort of recognize these efforts and congratulate us on actually, do you know what, we are stopping a lot of fraud here. How about yourself? How are things from your side of things, Richard?
So I think Gary there summarised the kind of how I believe that we're getting better at finding fraud, but fraud is a constantly evolving landscape, and as we said, I think from card payments on to APMs and the payments ecosystem is nice and complex. So where the fraudsters hide can change. But I actually see a big shift from our perspective in our customers looking for trust, and that's very much in looking at, rather than obviously managing fraud is important and managing spikes in fraud and trying to figure out where the fraudsters are going next, but actually trusting good customers, accepting more good business, and building up trusted identities is certainly what we're kind of seeing a lot more in terms of the focus from customers.
Yep, and that's very interesting. This sort of trend there that fraud is constantly changing. Is that something you're seeing, that they're maybe not going for the credit card fraud, but they're actually attacking you in different ways, trying to get different bits of information?
Is that for me?
Yeah, I'll always start with you, so just keep it flowing.
Sure, yeah, I think so. I think, the ecosystem starts with data collection, and, they may have an initial objective, but they'll take the data still, and if they can find another way to do bad things, I think they will. Just back to the issue of trust, I think, that is something that every company, certainly eBay, we're focused on. It's trust in many, many ways. I would suggest that, the trust with the data initially, and why being transparent about why we're collecting it actually engenders trust. We're here to do, you could say things like, we're here to protect you, but you can also say more specific things, I think, that will engender trust in the long term. I think customers often are reluctant to share as much information if they don't have that control over their and confidence in the data initially. And so I think, in all of these regulatory models, some of the things that were being discussed previously in open data, open banking, those things are all built to work together to engender trust. And I think, they're not all, some of the things I work on, it's like, oh, well, which one trumps the other thing, or these things are at odds. I kind of like to think about them in a positive way, which is they're all really working towards these societally beneficial objectives.
Okay. No, thank you. Gary?
Yeah, and Etsy is hugely focused on trust, as you would expect. And we recognize that, being a trustworthy brand and delivering a trustworthy service is good for business, right? And we're here to do business, obviously, for both ourselves, but our sellers too. And I think for us, it's really building the trust on the buyer side, making sure that they're not, I suppose, exposed to that fraudulent behavior, but also on the seller side, both them trusting us and us trusting them within our ecosystem. So it's really building capabilities around that. What we're seeing in recent times is far more sophisticated fraud tactics being undertaken by fraudsters on our platform. And that's very dynamic. Our fraudsters are very, very dynamic. We're seeing changes quickly, and we need to move quickly in real time to be able to fight that in an effective way and really engender that trust within our user base and make sure that we retain that with our users.
Thank you. And again, Richard.
So I think, just to kind of cover off what the guys are saying, we're very much seeing at SIFT a democratization of fraud. Fraud's becoming this kind of big collaborative business, and one would wonder sometimes whether it's almost easier for them to collaborate and build their connections than it is for us. And that does mean that fraud is naturally going to move around. I think that how I get. But God forbid we should also think about the consumer experience as well, and that's presumably how something that's very important. Again, going back to that trust thing, the fraudsters have access to AI, and certainly can create much better emails than they could a couple of years ago with spelling mistakes and grammatical errors. And I think that the data's out there, so unfortunately, it's kind of how many times does my phone tell me that email address and that password has been compromised? Yes. So the data's out there, so they've got a lot of the tools and a lot of the collaboration going in their favour.
And really, we have a fantastic panel here, because the companies you represent are truly international. Do you find that there is a difference between how you're being targeted by criminals in different countries, or is it the sort of same old, because it works here, it works there, it works there? Again, starting at the end.
Yeah, I think it's just, it's a global approach. I don't think, we can really focus on particular regions, though you do see trends in terms of certain types of fraud tactics come out of certain regions. That might be a starting point. But I don't think, I think you'd be remiss to approach it in a jurisdictional way.
Yeah, I'd definitely agree, and I think you can learn a lot from each jurisdiction that you operate in. They generally learn from each other, and I suppose those tactics move to different countries and locations, and having that kind of insight early on in the origination jurisdiction is helpful in detecting that later on our platform. I would say that being a global organization as well, you get global attacks, right? Like, they're bigger. You've got bigger, organizations or fraudsters trying to really infiltrate your systems, and that's something for sure as a global organization that is kind of an added challenge to managing fraud.
Thank you, Richard.
I think so. Probably the observation from me would be geographically. There are probably bigger differences in liability, so that can often drive the types of fraud that we see in different geos. But actually, I see a lot of value in looking across verticals. So where we're covering many different use cases across different, whether it's charities or gambling companies or banks or fintechs or merchants. Seeing how fraud moves across those and moves between them is really indicative.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I've had a question come in already from the audience. Thank you. Do keep sending them in. And I'll just take a little change, just one small change to it. So, what role does the increase in real-time technology play in your business to help combat fraud? Richard, I'll start with you.
So, I guess two sides to that. So from I think we're going to probably move on a bit later to the more cybersecurity aspects of protecting, of ring fencing our data centers and the data that we have available. From SIFT's perspective, I suspect that it's not dissimilar to many others in that we need to be rapid and real time around that. SIFT as a platform is developed as a real time solution. So we expect to get you, if you ask us for a risk score, we expect to give that back to you in less than 250 milliseconds. Wow. And so, very much, the digital economy begs for that. We wouldn't be able to provide we probably wouldn't be any success at all if we couldn't do that.
Yeah. Gary?
Yeah, it's going to be really important for us insofar as the sooner we identify, we can manage the situation. So it's really taking action early, making sure we're curtailing the impact of any sort of attack on our platform, making sure that we're learning from that in real time, and that we're applying any learnings from that into our monitoring solutions longer term, so that we can identify that type of behavior in future. But really, with this stuff, it's real time is important. You need to know what's happening on your platform at all times and be able and equipped to deal with that.
Yeah, and from my perspective, I think it just makes even more important the necessity for internal groups like risk, compliance, legal to collaborate and to have working models so that we can work together to build out operating, because from a legal perspective, these things have to be thought of in advance. You have to react really fast. We have to react really fast. But also at the same time, we have to think through how we're going to do it and how that fits within the legal requirements that we need to comply with. So it makes kind of an agile way of working even more important than it would be already.
No, thank you. And I kind of guess that leads on to my next question, because you've sort of set it up nicely about regulation. We are seeing increasing regulation coming from Europe, and now that the UK's Brexited, we're getting UK-only regulation. How do you see regulation impacting your business? Cameron, as the legal man, I think this is one we should start with yourself.
Yeah, sure.
And you've got 19 minutes.
I will not bore you. I will keep this as short and sweet as possible. But from a privacy standpoint, I think that we're generally aligned in the UK and the European Union. There's talk of UK GDPR reform, but at present, those two regimes are generally aligned. However, as previously mentioned briefly, the requirements and the expectations, I would say, of the two sets of regulators, financial services regulators and data protection authorities, are not always aligned. And one example of this is within GDPR, UK GDPR, there's a concept of data minimization. There's a concept of necessity. There is a lawful basis under GDPR Article 6 called, is it necessity to comply with a legal requirement? So that gets into whether it's required or not, or whether it's something more than is legally required, right? And as we all know in this room, that's not exactly how risk-based decisions, risk engines, fraud controls work, right? I think those conversations between financial services regulators and data protection authorities could be improved. I think they are improving. I've been to several conferences like these where they've been on stage, and I think they are beginning to have more synergies and those types of between a rock and hard place. The Etsy's and the eBays, the SIFs. We're between the rock and the hard place, and so they are recognizing that. But it is a challenge. I think an additional thing that is a challenge in this context is the consumer's right to access and transparency versus tipping off, and the inability from a tipping off perspective to kind of convey all of the details if it leads to more risk to the consumer.
Yes.
Or if it aids the bad guys. Lastly, just because I think it's really relevant now, automated decision making to act in real time. There's certain regimes within GDPR that provide an ability to object. The user can object. Of course, the consumer cannot object to doing fraud controls, right? But they have an objection. They have the legal right to object to automated processing if it has a significant legal effect. So that's also just doesn't fit neatly. And lastly, not to take up 17 minutes and 14 seconds, but biometrics, increasingly used more. I moved recently from Ireland to the UK. So I've noticed it's more prevalent in the UK than in Ireland, but that has to be based on consent, a consent model, right? Which is a challenge because it has to be freely given and transparent, et cetera. So all of those things, I think, when we're talking about reforms to Payment Services Directive or other financial service regimes, I think it will make it harder on companies. If those types of things are not addressed, at least in some way to provide some guidance on what's expected from both sides of the regulatory landscape.
Thank you very much. Gary?
Yeah, I don't know how I follow that.
You're allowed to say I agree.
I agree. No, absolutely. I think, look, regulation is always going to be a challenge. I think we'd be naive to think that it isn't. I do feel, though, that it's a real strategic advantage if you're good at compliance. And I think if you're good at adopting regulation early and quickly and succinctly, then you can really get ahead of your competitors. And I do feel like we as organizations need to think about investing in those spaces to be able to do that in kind of a better way. I do think regulators don't always understand the intricacies of applying or the practical application of what they've written. So I think engaging with those bodies and making sure that our voices are heard when we do get something that we just can't do or that doesn't make sense for the industry is important. And I'm seeing more and more that regulators are taking that voice on board and using organizations like the EMEA. Judith was up here this morning. We are members of that organization. It's been really helpful in kind of pushing our opinion forward to the regulators when they're setting their rules. And Richard?
So I think a couple of Cameron's points there around, I think when I first started out on the vendor side of fraud, it was before GDPR came in, and so there was a lot more consortia and sharing of data across the parties, which obviously was a great advantage to fighting fraud, and was obviously delighted when GDPR made allowances for that in the way in which we can use data for fraud detection. But there's a kind of distinct difference. It's interesting when we look at the kind of more physical side of fraud, KYC and onboarding, AML, PEP sanctions, etc., versus the kind of more digital side of fraud that can be much more pseudonymized. And so I think that's a piece that's really made a big difference to the vendor side is finding ways in which we can create connections, but only if you have some form of identifier for that particular footprint, digital footprint. And I've also seen, I guess, maturity in data privacy and acceptance of that. So where previously we wouldn't have seen many of the German commerce merchants wanting to participate in global networks. They wanted to buy very much from German providers with German data. We're seeing a lot of that open up now. I think there's a recognition that we live in a digital global economy and that they need platforms to be able to fight that.
Yeah. And I guess one of the things I've seen from my side of things has been PSD2 coming through, strong customer authentication. At the same time almost that a lot of people were trying to make e-commerce more frictionless, easy to use. Have you found that strong customer authentication has sort of clashed heads in a way with frictionless payments, or are you now having to introduce slightly modified ways that still trying to keep your programs as frictionless as possible, yet still meet the requirements of PSD2 and strong customer authentication? Gary, let's start with yourself.
It's certainly a challenge, right? And I think everyone lost their mind when SEA came out, but really, in my mind, it has been a good thing for our industry. I think if we didn't have that today, we would be looking at much higher figures on that UK finance report. So certainly, I think it has had a positive influence. It's something it took a while for the industry to get used to and kind of work with. But I would argue that if you really put a lot of effort and time and good people working on the solution, you come up with a better user experience overall. So if we take the example of Google Pay or Apple Pay now, like that's much easier than putting a credit card number onto a website like we had to do 5 or 10 years ago. So for me, I think it's actually driven some innovation in that area and actually added to the security of the transaction overall. So I do think overall it's a good thing. I know at the time when it was introduced, obviously caused a lot of angst amongst merchants and processors, but in the long run, it was a good thing.
Cameron?
Yeah, I would agree with that, and just the emphasis on how we can provide this additional information, how you can go from one place to another in a smooth way, but still have things within the user's access or control. And not just putting all this legalese on one page. I mean, there's some middle ground there, and I know in my company we spend a lot of time working together to find that middle ground and to have a smooth customer experience, and to keep making that better. But at the same time, we do have to meet these requirements, and it's taken some creative solutioning, I think, to get there.
Richard.
So Gary made the point there of, I think when things started out, there was certainly a lot of, kind of moving around, and there was a lot of cost associated with employing these technologies, and also deciding where the liability sat, which I think was a big contributor. Now I think we're getting to a stage where it's about the consumer experience as well, and obviously alternative payment methods being a big shift, and I guess where this could lead to is more of a kind of identity focus. So how do we create identities for that kind of digital footprint or that physical user?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think the interesting thing, as I've watched this, has been that it's almost been one of the drivers towards all of the wallets, that you're now authenticating yourself using your mobile phone, and then you're using the payment method you want to be able to undertake the payment, which has been interesting from a moving of the credit card and the debit card into that wallet space. But as you were saying there, Richard, about it actually expands the opportunities for alternative payment methods. And I think this sort of other one, where I think it was Marion who was talking about the fourth dimension of it, it just happens. Again, the use between the wallet, the mobile phone, the strong customer authentication, the relationship, that is going to enable that to happen, but also subtly change how the criminals are going to look at that as well, which is quite a fascinating situation. And I guess that leads me on to my next question, which is something else that I've seen more recently and growing increasingly, probably post or during COVID, post-COVID, is we're seeing more and more use of third parties, fourth parties, fifth parties in this sort of payment space. When I first started working in payments, it was a fourth-party model. We knew exactly who was where, and that was it. Since then, we've now got the third-party payment service providers doing a great job. How are you seeing this? How are you bringing this into your organizations, into that payment process? And how do you manage those relationships so that they're not the way the criminals are going to try and break in and cause fraud for you? Cameron, difficult one.
Yeah, it's a difficult one. I don't know about the last part you said, but so on topic for the first parts, I mean, it's an additional challenge as to who the actor is, which legal regimes apply to that actor, transparency as to what the actor's role is, whether, for example, whether this is a data processor under relevant regimes or a data controller makes a heck of a difference, and then having, the user have trust in the overall ecosystem and not feel that they're subterranean actors that they had no way of knowing, right? So providing that assurance as to the trust of the overall system, but also, an ability to discern like who's participating in the system. And so that goes back, I think, to one of the challenges from the user perspective and just going through the customer journey and how we can solve some of those problems within the customer journey in a way that doesn't overwhelm or deter the customer.
Yeah. Gary.
Yeah, I think a lot of organizations now are moving to a very outsource-heavy model of operating, and it makes sense, right? There's companies out there that are much better equipped to provide some of the services that they require to deliver for their customers. But with that comes risk, and I think for those types of organizations, it's really important that a really robust third-party risk management framework and model is built out with proper resourcing, because really understanding your suppliers, your partners, and their ecosystem is so important in ensuring resiliency and continuity of your service overall and the safety of your users. And I think that comes back to the trust thing again, like really making sure that you're building the infrastructure internally to, like, you've made a conscious decision to outsource these things, but you still own that relationship with your seller, and you need to protect that. And to do that, you need to really understand who your partners are and who their partners are and how all that works, and really teasing out where you could have, single points of failure and that sort of thing, even, as fourth or fifth parties in the chain.
Richard.
So I guess, it's interesting. I've spent a lot of time in the kind of banking space with fraud, but coming more into the e-commerce space with Sift, it's really quite gobsmacking how complex the payments ecosystem is. And so, how does a merchant know which payment service provider to work with, which acquirer to work with, which issuers to work with? I mean, I think trust is so important, but also that it seems to be a kind of a very open market now, where merchants will have a lot more options. But then it goes back to data sharing, because maybe the acquirer sitting on the other side of the fence would prefer to have more data sharing with the merchants in order to make better decisions and provide a better service. So it's a really complex industry. But I think, speaking to the guys who are on the cold face, I think that it would strike me that trust is probably the best way of actually being able to service the consumer, which is presumably why we're all here.
Yeah, absolutely. From PCI's perspective, just on that one, it's something we've had to expand our data security standard to take into consideration, because more and more of these entities have access into the card data environment. Securing that, ensuring that those third parties are taking the necessary precautions is something we've had to incorporate into our standards. So it's the, as the evolution of the payment life cycle changes and grows, then we have to adapt, and I think we all have to adapt, because this is how people want it. But to try and make it work fast, efficient, secure is always that constant challenge that we're trying to deal with. I'm conscious we're getting towards the end of our session, so I've got one last question. You can pick on this whichever way you like. What keeps you up at night? Cameron, what keeps you awake at night in terms of fraud and security and all of the challenges that we've talked about today?
I'll just be honest on the panel. What keeps me up at night is me as the lawyer being too pedantic about things, and not, perhaps inhibiting sometimes, and things cross my desk because I'm focused on these rigid frameworks. And that's not to say that I'm not pedantic, because I am admitting it on the panel. But just, I think to go to your example in terms of the data sharing among partners in the ecosystem, I mean, if law and policy makers would just come out and say, this is legally required, we expect you to do this as participants in the payment ecosystem, I mean, I'm not sure you'd need me that much, right? It may be shooting myself in the foot in terms of my job security, but that would be very, very, very helpful for participants in the ecosystem.
Excellent. Gary?
For me, I think it's the rate of change that we've seen in recent times. Obviously, with the introduction of AI and kind of the expansion of machine learning, it's great internally. We're able to leverage those to develop our tools and do a better job, but so can the fraudsters. And I feel like, I think we're only starting to see what's possible from a criminal's perspective, and that will change our landscape considerably over the coming years. So yeah, for me, it's just rate of change and keeping up with that change so that we can protect our platform.
Richard?
So I guess the thing that I find myself thinking most about is helping our customers to accept more good business. As a byproduct of that, hopefully, we make sure that we we manage the fraud. Truth being, the only way of stopping fraud 100% is to do no business at all. So, it's trying to find that right balance, but making sure that we accept more good business and therefore provide better consumer experience.
Yeah. From my own perspective, it's a bit like yourself, Gary. It's that rate of change. When I feel as though I'm just getting on top of something, I'm like, oh, that standard's really good on that. New technology comes along, you're like, ah. And you want the new technology to come along, but you can see at the same time, yes, it's going to be good, but also the criminals are going to get hold of it very quickly and utilize it in their own way. You mentioned AI. I'm sorry we've not had more time to go into the depth of AI. That's a completely different session. But AI scares me more than anything, purely because of the fact that, as we've all discussed about today, we follow the rules. We have to follow the rules. The criminals never follow the rules. They just utilize whatever they can to their best advantage. And I guess in many regards, AI is going to give them that. Can they use it for account takeover? That's what scares me. As someone said earlier, the ability of AI to write these phishing emails now is like, they are perfect. And so that is an interesting challenge. Gentlemen, I'd like to thank you all for this session. I hope everyone has found this to be a really useful session. There are a million more questions. I had more questions that we never got to. If you're around, do please hang about, and do please come and talk to us all at the breaks, and we'll be delighted to go in any more details. And with that, gentlemen, thank you very, very much indeed. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Jeremy.